podcast. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the audio-only show. In this episode, my co-host Pascal Robert and I talk to friend of show, economist and professor Rob Larson about an article he wrote in Current Affairs last year, actually. I think Pascal came about the article, and I was like, "Oh, Rob wrote this, and he's a friend of the show. He's been on a few times." Before I even was doing live streaming, Rob came on back in the audio-only days, and the first ever video clip I made was a clip of Rob talking about how cell phones are made from state-sponsored research. All the major components inside of cell phones don't come from the innovation of tech overlords that love telling us about the free market breeds innovation. How the touchscreen technology had been around for a long time before Apple took it up, actually. IBM was pitched it first from the U.S. government. They said, nah. Anyway. In this episode, we talk about the IMF, their history, how they came to be, what their function has always meant to be. Talk about neocolonialism. Now, this episode is, of course, very near and dear to the heart of my co-host, as his family is Haitian. He's of Haitian descent. And if anyone has a bad taste in their mouth, a burr in their britches about the IMF, it's Pascal Robert. And a very deserving feeling of animosity toward the IMF World Bank. So he really enjoyed the first half. The second half was a lot of fun. The second half, you know, Pascal goes, "Jason, I think we might have put the second half up." I was like, nope. But it was a conversation they got to have about Milton Friedman and the early roots of neoliberalism. Great conversation. And definitely the chat in the second half. Because what we do, if you don't watch the show, because we know we're behind a paywall in the second half, we actually put the chat on the screen. When we first started, we used to do that, but it's way too distracting. The chat is just way more interactive in the second half than the first half. There's definitely some Russia-Ukraine talk, even though that wasn't what we were discussing. But if you want to hear that second half, there's only one way. Become a patron. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Wherever you are listening to the show, there are links in the description. You get all of the bonus after hours / champagne room access, and we are doing movie night again. We want to watch A Soldier's Story and then talk about it afterwards. So I'm excited for that. Movie night this month in March for patrons only. So enjoy this talk with Rob Larson about the cruelty of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And I am out. Greetings, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. If you are new to the show, please hit the like, please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the bell, as we are constantly adding new programming to the channel. As we had last night, the fourth episode of our bi-weekly sports show, Beyond the Red Zone. And tomorrow night, we will be hosting Forrest and Conan, movie night extravaganza. I'm not exactly sure what movie they'll be talking about, but it's usually a good time. Also, if you haven't done it, another part of our show, Kuba, Deep State Kuba, was featured on Doug Lane's Diet Soap, and people are raving about that appearance. And he recently was on Parallax Views with our homie friend of the show, JG Michael. So please check that out. And without any further ado, let me bring in my homie, my dog, the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
Speaking of special appearances, you and I were on David Feldman's show yesterday.
Let me tell you right now, I thoroughly enjoyed doing Brother Feldman's show. I enjoyed it very much.
I was very happy you were there. You guys probably couldn't tell that I was extremely exhausted. I had put that intro clip together hella quick to try to get it up, and I appreciate you being there and stealing the show as usual.
I did not. He was very, let me tell you something. Shout out to Brother Feldman. He was very nice, very congenial, asked very probing questions, and put us to work. Literally.
That he did.
Put us to work. Now, I want you to talk about, no. Talk about this. Explain it more. Explain it better. No, Pascal. I think you're wrong about that. Okay, Dave, no problem. Let me know. I really, he was very congenial. He was very nice. And I really appreciated his encouragement of us to participate on his show. He was a very nice gentleman.
No, I like going on Feldman's show. Well, I'll tell you about it off air. There's some good news off air from the show that's going to help.
Great.
It's definitely an off air conversation.
Programming.
Yes, programming. Good news for us. I don't want to. Someone says Jason posing in front of a blockbuster movie poster. Nah, this is my green screen backdrop.
Jason likes to surprise us with his backdrop regularly. Jason is tired because Jason has been editing as if he is basically a peon working at 20th Century Fox, playing old commercials from like movie intros.
I will not be on the Saturday show, as I will be driving up to attempt to see my son this weekend. So it's a 500+ mile drive, so I can't make the Saturday show. So Pascal will be taking over the reins of the show with Stefan. Is Kuba going to be on Saturday show? Are you sure?
I don't know. What about Marcus? Is Marcus him?
Oh, shit. Yeah, him too. The other one.
Who do we have for Saturday?
I don't remember. It's Tuesday. Let me just get through today.
Yes, just do that.
Well, before we bring in our guests, the main question we're asking tonight is about the IMF and the World Bank. How can an organization that was designed to help rebuild Europe and their former colonies after the Second World War be responsible for building what former economic hitman John Perkins calls a global empire? To bring some clarity and explain that to us, please welcome professor and economist Rob Larson.
Fellas, the crowd really loved that when I came in. That's great.
Oh yeah, they're all about it. And you know what? I also have, because I know you're a wisecracker.
Oh,
a wisecracker. You what? Coming out with the racial pejorative already?
Double entendre.
Wow. already starting. Wow. Okay.
You can't trust those Negroes from Oakland, Rob.
I teach, but I learn a lot. Like that's life.
I didn't see the wisecracker one coming. So Pascal, you got me on that one. You legitimately got me. Like I'm literally thrown for a loop right now. That you came out the gates with the jokes this time.
It's not uncommon.
No, you coming out the gates with the funnies?
It happens sometimes.
Well,
everyone thinks I'm scowling and mean. This is just my normal. Yeah, dude, I'm Haitian, man. My father left Haiti during the Papa Doc years. We don't smile regularly. It's just cultural. Don't get upset.
Makes sense.
Well, Rob, can you tell us a little bit about the formation of the IMF and the World Bank and what their original function was and how they function today? And how does their function even differ from the colonial system?
Yeah, sure. Well, the IMF and the World Bank, that's the International Monetary Fund. These are a couple of really big global financial institutions. They're basically created by the Western countries after World War II. There's a big financial conference that basically the US and Britain hold toward the end of the war called the Bretton Woods Conference. Folks may be aware of that. And that was where they kind of worked out the whole post-war monetary system that we had for a long time. And it had lots of currency and market provisions and stuff. But it created these guys nominally to help countries develop, because the idea was that we had, at that time, what we called the third world, the poor countries of the world in Latin America and Africa and South and Southeast Asia. And the idea was these countries, they need aid in developing. So the World Bank originally was supposed to be basically sort of what it does today, is offering development project coordination and organizing loans so that big countries in the developing world can borrow money and use it to build bridges and dams and ports so they can export products and develop their domestic industries and become less unbelievably penniless, of course, which was the idea. Now, of course, the reason these countries were so much poorer at this point, at the end of World War II, than the European countries had been before the war, was because of that colonial system, right? As Jason was just saying a second ago, it's about colonialism. Most of the countries that are in those big regions we mentioned, Latin America, Africa, Asia, those countries got developed in the framework of colonization by those European powers. Britain had lots of Africa and that whole Indian empire. France had Vietnam and West Africa. Even nice, sweet Holland, controlled Indonesia fairly brutally for a long time. And that's colonialism. The United States was a colony, but we had an early successful war to break away. Basically, us and the Japanese were the ones who got to have most of our modern history outside of a colonial system. And that's why we're developed countries today, because we had that independence. And so when these countries had big empires, they would use their possessions, as they called them, their imperial possessions, like British India, for a couple purposes. They made them buy their Industrial Revolution products, which is a big deal after the Industrial Revolution. So they used them as captive markets, obviously sources for raw materials from, petroleum to fuel the European Industrial Revolution, all the way just to, the original thing that they were after, which was spices to rescue all that boring British cooking. But that put these countries in a dependent relationship where Europe basically developed in significant part at the expense of those poor countries by stripping them of resources and by forcing them to buy industrial products from Europe and later the United States, rather than developing that industry themselves that would give them, the big productivity and value added that makes your workers so productive that fewer and fewer of you have to work in desperate agriculture, and you could have more doctors and engineers and stuff like that. So the World Bank was supposed to help all these countries of the world rebuild after they had been imperial possessions for so long. They had to fight big wars just to get independent of the European countries. People we think of as big saintly figures like Winston Churchill for leading the British resistance to the Nazis in World War II, was one of these great figures for saying, let's take lots of food away from India to feed the British army. Let's suppress these Kurds rebelling in British Iraq with poison gas. These guys were all about forcing these countries to have these very brutal wars just for independence, and it left these countries wrecked with big military, authoritarian governments. And these countries often had to pay money back to the imperial powers that they had just won independence from so that they could take over the big colonial assets. Like Egypt, once it reached independence, had to pay Britain, the equivalent of today's money, billions and billions of dollars for the Suez Canal, which was built by Egyptian labor in Egypt. But Britain used to control it, and now they don't, so they get paid instead of paying back these countries who they've been.
Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal at some point in time, and that really pissed
Exactly. That was the occasion for that compensation payment. That's right. So what we see with these countries is when they're trying to transition back to independence, if they nationalize some big asset like a copper mine or a big canal or a railroad, they'd often end up paying lots of money back to Europe, at least if they wanted to remain part of the world economy and not get sanctioned out of it, which we're seeing a lot of these days. But if they didn't, then these assets just stay in the hands of Europeans or Americans and their corporations. So like in South Africa, most of the arable farmland in South Africa is still owned by that same white minority that ran the apartheid regime there for all those decades, right? So they said, if you don't want a civil war, we'll let you guys have elections where black people can vote, but you're not going to get the land from us. We'll fight for that. And the ANC said, the African National Congress accepted that. So what you see around the world is stories like that, either countries having to pay money back to the rich bastards that controlled them just to take over some of their own resources, or just letting the Europeans and American and white corporations keep owning that land or those resources, or those mines, whatever kind of privatized resource it might be. But that's what the World Bank was supposed to be helping these countries get out of, was that imperial relationship.
Rob, I appreciate you very much.
You're getting an echo in, Rob.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll turn down the audio. Sorry about that.
You want to go ahead and ask that question, Pascal?
Yeah, Rob, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
Thank you.
Hold on. I'm getting an echo myself.
Oh,
You might want to close some screens, Pascal.
I don't know where that's going on. Please excuse me.
You got music playing.
Hold on a second.
That's not me, is it? No, it's not.
No, it's someone else.
Pascal is.
I was having some trouble with. I apologize about that, Rob. I want to tell you that I was very impressed with the article because, as I told you in the green room, to see someone in the contemporary left address the issue of the IMF and the World Bank, which, as we were saying, was something that was a normal kind of point of contention for the new left of the '60s and early '70s, really made me hope that the spirit of left internationalism that I was raised around from my parents being, people who came from the Caribbean during that period of the 60s, being reborn again. And what's funny to me is that I know one of your ultimate historical enemies made a rather provocative comment about colonialism and imperialism in a video. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, Milton Friedman, and being asked at some kind of campus conference, was asked by, I believe it was a black student, about the role of colonialism and imperialism in enriching Europe. And there's a video of Friedman literally denying that colonialism and imperialism had any significant economic contribution to the coffers of European development, which I found funny. I said that just to kind of tickle you a bit because I know how much you love Milton Friedman. I'm being sarcastic. Completely.
Yes, that's great. I don't know that exact clip, but that's interesting. Friedman kind of is like that. Milton Friedman, obviously the great author of the seminal conservative classic that everyone should hate read, Capitalism and Freedom. Yeah, he was more of like an accommodating libertarian type, like he worked for Reagan and Thatcher, and was willing to make stances that were more like politically based. We should consider privatizing Social Security. And then you have people like Hayek who are saying, I'd rather have a market-based dictatorship than European social democracy that constrains the marketplace. So these guys are kind of slimy, but they vary in how much, they would recognize that imperialism or colonialism is wrong. That kind of makes sense that Friedman would say that. Yeah, that's one of the many reasons to read my book-length rebuttal of that SOB.
Excellent. So the main question I wanted to ask you about the IMF and World Bank is that how does the IMF become a tool of the concept that is very popular going back to Kwame Nkrumah and Fanon, neocolonialism. And can you explain exactly how the aspirational model of the IMF as a tool of lending resources to the global south, if you will, that's my term of art for that particular region, turns into this form of capital extraction parasitically that renders so many of these countries into destitution. In your honest opinion, do you think that was always the intention, and that what the initial reasoning was pretextual? Or do you think that there's something that happens as we move from the post-colonial era of the 50s and 60s into the neoliberal era of the 50-plus counter-revolution post-68?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. So the IMF, originally the World Bank is the main thing. Yeah, it's going to help lift up all these countries that the West had spent centuries keeping down and stomping on. But remember, through all of this, there's a nice supportive ideology, which will play a role whenever institutions, do a big policy change along these kind of lines. That there's, people have to rationalize it to themselves in this way. So in the 50s, the World Bank is giving out lots of loans all through the Cold War period. Giving out these loans. It's when these U.S.-supported Cold War dictators take those loans and put it straight up their noses for their coke habits and their international travel lifestyles and all the things that make dictators slimy. And they take that money and they corruptly remove it from public accounts, and it goes into some Swiss or other Caribbean unknown bank account somewhere, right? So that means that these countries full of poor people are now on the hook for these giant development loans that they may or may not have even benefited from, And so a lot of us left economists would say this is odious debt, that these countries are being forced to repay, money flowing from these very poor countries to us richer countries. It's pretty hideous. But that transition, for the IMF, comes from this development model failing. I think that's kind of the key to the transition, is my understanding at least. The World Bank is giving these countries money for these loans. Some of it gets invested in developing the countries, building all the dams and highways that you get in the post-war era. There is real growth in there, of course. But so much of this money gets siphoned out for all your various corrupt practices by the elites and your big business projects. So what comes to happen is these countries don't meet the big growth targets that justify the loans. And now we have to figure out how you're going to repay these loans. That's when the IMF, as more and more of these countries start falling behind and their debt burdens mount, and especially what makes the IMF transition into its current role, which is kind of forcing these countries painfully to pay off their loans. Sometimes we call the IMF today the credit community's enforcer, because they force you to pay off these loans in various ways. If you don't work with the IMF, you're locked out of the bond market. Your country never borrows money again. And you're a poor country. That's no joke. That's a pretty serious thing. So I think it's when the countries start falling behind, the IMF starts saying, okay, this is about twisting your arm to get the money back out of you. And that's where the structural adjustment programs come in.
Well, we'll move to that too, but one slight addition that I want to make to your paradigm, which is very much correct. I don't think we should give a pass to these neocolonial global leaders who end up becoming corrupt arbiters of the affairs of these countries. Is that let's not deny the fact that many of these corrupt leaders are placed by the same countries that buttress the IMF and the World Bank, particularly after mysteriously causing the death, coup, or removal of general leftist or more proletarian-based leaders who were interested in actually distributing resources to the masses of their country, i.e. Thomas Sankara, i.e. Amilcar Cabral, i.e. Kwame Nkrumah, who, though he may not have been assassinated, we get the trend of how, particularly in the post-colonial moment, all of these leaders who were Marxist friendly or MLs or kind of socialists in terms of their worldview, get cooled, assassinated, removed, even after the early 70s revolutions in which you have Kuba and Fidel helping them overturn the colonial lectures like in Angola and so on and so forth. The neocolonial efforts to sabotage the socialist or Marxist attempts of these countries are extremely punitive and neutralizing of their capacity to have really wealth redistributive paradigms. If you can you talk about the process in which the IMF works to help facilitate the newly liberated particularly African and global South countries, who considered using socialism as a model and unfortunately forced them to end up surrendering to the neoliberal order. If you feel comfortable in talking about that, I'd love to hear your analysis on that.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I think that's a really, really important addition there, Pascal. I appreciate that. Yeah, and in the affairs article, we have more space. I talk a little bit at least about that. Yeah, like the capital fact after World War II is Europe gradually loses its colonies and they gradually become military satellites of the United States. So those figures that you mentioned, I mean, you just named some of like the great figures of the African resistance and independence movements against the various European states that controlled them for very long periods of time. Yeah, they get killed by our intelligence services or by our colonial forces, or kind of more often by little militias and paramilitaries we can prop up and then pretend we had no involvement with. But yeah, that's who dies in the post-war. Like those are the leaders who die in the Cold War era. It's the independent leftists getting close or reaching power. Lumumba, Allende, it's Mossadegh in Iran who gets overthrown. It's not Pinochet and it's not Mobutu and these other dictators who work with the West and work with the IMF and let the U.S. put bases in their country if we want to do that. Again, if these countries get out of control, we usually the first step is we start making a relationship with their military and giving some of their senior military figures aid and maybe training and maybe weapons, maybe encouraging messages that if you chopped off your social democratic nationalist leader's head, we'd let one of you become president and not sanction you. And the worst punishment, though, as you sort of intimated, right, is for those states that were able to break away to different degrees from that sort of global market, globally market policed and U.S. police system. So countries, like Cuba, and to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia, like these countries take at least, you could debate how much socialism there is in these countries. A lot of them are very authoritarian, partially because they're fighting the French and the Americans constantly just to gain control of their own national territory. So I think it is reasonable to give these countries some leniency because everyone wants to say, oh, Vietnam, dictatorship, Cuba, censorship. Well, we're constantly trying to overthrow the governments. Like that will make your regime more reactive and paranoid, and the same is true for any country. Yeah, like in Angola or in Chile that makes serious steps toward having some kind of leftist policy program. I mean, if the IMF can't get their leaders to call it off, and they often can by winking at them, embezzling money from World Bank loans. That's when the CIA will start making, and our military will start making more contacts with your armed forces. It's a pretty heinous record, but it's all based on having access to that money and power. And the context is that, again, neocolonial development model, which was sort of the key to that last thing we were mentioning, right? The reason why these countries couldn't pay off all the debts, all the loans that they took out, was because that development model really didn't deliver the growth that it was supposed to, right? It was all about going on doing what they did mostly during the colonial system, exporting raw materials, not trying to have a big state-led process of industrialization that's inefficient or maybe socialist, So you're going to do it through the market, and what do you know, that doesn't happen. Now we have to take away all of your public support programs when the IMF comes in and demands all these structural adjustment programs in exchange for fresh loans. And that's how the third world got most of its nationalized assets privatized over the last 30 years. It's pretty brutal, but it's incredible. Like people think in the developing world, like there's lots of socialism, they're poor, so they must be socialist. We made them capitalist by installing dictators and leveraging the power of debt over these countries. Like it's a pretty ugly record, but that's the clear story.
And also showing them even if you try to nationalize something, you have to be a socialist. Even if you try to nationalize something, we will come down with a very, very hard hammer. I wanted to ask you if you can kind of explain in like how it actually looks, what we're talking about with this neocolonial model. I don't know if you're familiar with the project in the Philippines from the 80s during the Marcos regime to have a nuclear power plant built that was going to be more on a fault line. It was built on a fault line, and it was going to be built worse than Chernobyl. And Marcos, gave it the okay. And I forget how many billions it cost. I believe it's still there in the Philippines. I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with this project that can let us know if it's no longer there. But could you explain maybe one of these projects that are built by some of these kind of American-friendly dictatorial governments that take IMF loans and how they don't benefit the majority of the poor and probably only benefit a small elite class of people.
Yeah, for sure. So that's, books like John Perkins, who we mentioned a minute ago, like that's what his book is about. So we're going to borrow this money and we're going to invest in these big projects. And often if you look, I think the key to all this is looking at what the projects were, because that's how you see what we were just referring to. These countries are being kept in basically the same economic role that they were in when they were full-on colonies. Just now the authoritarians running them are from their own country, and they're technically doing it just to satisfy their need to pay off the public debt rather than because Britain is telling you you're going to do that. It's basically the same policy. And so if you look at most of the developing world infrastructure, certainly what's been built since the 1980s, what you're going to see there is privatized stuff. But again, what that means, though, is those investments are going to be things that cater to that neocolonial arrangement. So the stuff that gets built are big roads, big ports. Like I always like to point out, if you look at like Europe or North America, those cities are connected by lots of roads. If you look at Latin America, especially, or Africa also, their roads are real, but they go from resources to cities to the ports. Like it's not about connecting all the cities so much and having them have a society. And we split all these people up into fighting states that were made at Europeans' convenience in the 1800s anyway. But all the infrastructure that's built with these loans, it's mostly extraction. It's extractive development. And we're exporting just straight crops instead of processing them and adding value and adding development and employment and more incomes. That's kind of an industrial thing. So why don't you just export that raw grain or legumes or soybeans or whatever to our developed world, and we'll do that industrial work of turning them into food and snacks and then sell those back to you guys. So it's a development model that keeps a lot of industrialization from happening. But even when these countries do industrialize, through outsourcing by our domestic multinationals or even through their own policy, because a couple of countries have gotten out of poverty, Korea, Taiwan, they did it by breaking all the rules and having lots of state-led development. But these countries, even when they have industry, they often don't get the benefits of industrialization in these traditional sort of developing world scenarios. So they don't have the growth. They end up owing all this money. The IMF puts in these crazy conditions, like you're going to privatize all these resources if they weren't already private. And you're going to cut public programs. You're going to cut taxes. You're going to lay off people who work for the public, right? You're going to raise interest rates because all these things make countries run a more balanced budget. And a higher interest rate encourages people to buy your currency, which currency traders and banks like a lot of, But these are also all depressive economic policies, higher taxes, less public employment, higher interest rates. All these things slow down the economy. And so they actually end up acting to keep these economies sort of trapped in this debt payment system where they're stuck with growth that's low because of the IMF's policies that they require for the new loans. And because they owe so much debt and they don't grow very fast, it's common for these countries to end up in recession, and the amount of debt they have relative to their economy actually gets bigger rather than smaller. Like they're getting further into debt by following the IMF's rules. In my article in Current Affairs, I actually cite a relatively recent IMF article that I've never seen anything quite like before. It's the IMF just having a report saying, if I remember right, the title is neoliberalism oversold? Neoliberalism is the big policy term for all of these policy frameworks in the developed and developing world. And they basically admitted, our development model doesn't seem to work. These countries seem to stay poor. Some of them owe even more money. What's going on around here? But it's just, some earnest technocrat recognizing that we're not really trying to help these countries develop. We want to keep them owing us money, sending us raw materials, buying our shitty products, with some U.S. accommodating ruler in charge, maybe one who will do what the IMF wants, and if they won't, we'll put a dictator in there. We do it all the time. So that's that neocolonial landscape. It wouldn't be so powerful, except these countries can't really develop exporting raw materials or basic goods. It's the processing and the industry and the value added that us developed countries cultivated, mostly using big government policies like big fat tariffs to allow us to do that. But that's where these countries get stuck. All the crazy privatization doesn't actually deliver growth. And without growth, they can't pay off the loans. Trapped forever, try to get out. The U.S. overthrows your government. This has kind of been the difficult position that the developing world's been in. And yeah, of course, that's a great point there in that question from Ron. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, why don't these countries, put up their own tariffs? Because that's how we developed, and the Germans and the Japanese and Korea and Taiwan, all the countries that developed basically after the Brits, the first ones, they did it by tariffs, taxes on imported products, keeps those foreign products more expensive and helps you develop your domestic economy. One of the things the IMF demands, is that free trade system. Free trade meaning no government limitations like tariffs or other subsidies, even though the only countries to have ever developed used those heavily. It doesn't mean you're going to develop if you use them, but those have always been tools that are used. So that's a great point, Ron, man. That's a huge part of it.
Rob, I really would like you to go into more detail about the nature of these structural adjustment programs, how they work and what they're about.
Yeah, so those SAPs, the structural adjustment programs, the IMF actually retired that term. They have some boring or phonier term like poverty reduction program now that's, sounds like they're defensive. The structural adjustment programs are just the government policy changes that the IMF demands from countries when they're getting their loans rolled over. You can't pay off these old loans that your previous dictator borrowed. You can't make these payments. That's bad. If you just default on these loans, you'll never get a loan again, which is scary when you're a poor country, right? So what they do instead is they'll say, okay, well, we'll give you new loans. We'll take these old loans, we'll pay them off, and you have a new loan now. Like when you refinance your own personal debts, right, on a much bigger scale. But we're going to make you do all these changes. And we have these structural adjustment program here. And so it's the few things we mentioned a second ago. Like one big one is privatization. That's usually a feature of these SAP programs that the IMF forces on these poor countries. And you're going to, for example, cut way back on your education and health spending. That's usually a big part of it. Cut back public services, So these countries have to cut down. That's indeed. These countries end up having to cut down their spending on health and public education at all levels to a certain percent of their GDP. The size of their economies. And it's interesting, countries like, Germany or other developed countries, usually their spending on health is about 10% of GDP, health and education. And these IMF loans will say, okay, yours is at 5, we need you to cut it to 2. Because that will free up room in your budget to pay off debt to banks in London and New York City, who you poor people owe money to. So we're going to lay off all you health workers who might help us deal with Ebola. We're going to lay off all you health workers who can help the horrifying infant mortality rate in much of Africa get down. You workers are going to help people in Latin America try to work around the Catholic Church and get some kind of birth control programs. These are important public health offices. It's expensive. Teachers are expensive. If we make these countries lay them off, now they can roll those dollars over to some budget line for debt payment, or what they often call debt service. Debt service is literally the term that's used. It's funny sometimes when institutions kind of, show the reality there. Like, you want to spend money on your building up the people in your country, building up their health and their education, job programs, preserve our messed up third world environment from you guys stripping all of its assets. You might want to spend money on that, but you need to spend that money on servicing your debt. You will continue to serve us, at least with your money, you poor people. And so that's kind of the incredible thing, as I wrote in that affairs article, fundamentally what these regimes are doing. Like right now, this is a couple-year-old estimate from the World Bank. It estimated third world external debt in the neighborhood of $4 trillion, which is an enormous amount. What that money, and that means every year far more money flows from Africa, Latin America, and Asia to Europe, Japan, and North America than we give them in aid, It's a factor of magnitude higher. So this comes to is, taxing Malala so that Donald Trump Jr.'s investment portfolio can go up, because those public bonds are held disproportionately by the rich, just like corporate stock in Google and Chase Bank is, So it's a pretty unbelievably globally heinous thing. And debt jubilee is exactly what's called for. The Catholic Church has been fighting for that forever, but, we only listen to the Catholic Church when they're helping us get rid of abortion. I don't want to hear about their weird econ populism. That's, people don't like that.
I do want to. Oh, you might want to check your monitor down.
Sorry about that.
You get a little bit of a slap back echo.
It happens.
So if you're familiar with rockabilly music, that's
shots totally fired.
you're sounding like the Cramps.
There we go.
How is this? How does this Western investment affect these material rich country or mineral rich countries, especially when we talk about deforestation and destroying the environment?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of incredible that the IMF, like all global institutions now, even the corporations have to pretend that they're very green and environmental because the global population just completely expects that now. A lot of the world is very concerned about climate change. Here in America, we have Fox News, so we know it's okay. But a lot of people are concerned about that, and it's pretty real. But it's amazing for the IMF to get away from that because they are the global body that has kept the developing world in a position of resource extraction-based development, right? An example I think I use it in this article, I've written about it in the past, is Indonesia, right? Formerly the Dutch colony. You know, everyone loves the Dutch and their freewheeling pot-smoking attitude. That's nice.
Please break this down. This is, I actually really like this. So please.
Right on. Yeah.
So excited. Bam.
Happy to. You know, these things get so abstract. Like a real example is kind of good. So Indonesia, you know, folks may know that the very large island archipelago country in Southeast Asia between like Vietnam and Australia, you know, former Dutch colony for many years, becomes independent after World War II, immediately becomes under control of the United States. We ran a big military coup there in the 60s that killed off most of the Communist Party members. This meant thousands and thousands of people died. No one talked about it in the West for years later. I mean, really, no one talks about it today. It's an extremely important country. Like in Cold War literature, the United States State Department used to use the term super domino to refer to Indonesia along with Japan. Like, sure, you know, South Korea, maybe they become communist, Vietnam, nuts. But Indonesia and Japan are these huge, important countries, and it's a very scary idea for them. So we've kept them very tightly under our control and let them do all kinds of heinous atrocities. You mentioned East Timor in here, where they ran a full-on genocide for many years with us paying for all of it and giving them all the weapons and so on. So pretty heinous series of regimes in the country. But they had various things going for them. Like they had some attitude of stewardship toward protecting some of those legacy resources, you know, like the giant tropical rainforests. This country's right on the equator, you know, so it's filled with thick tropical rainforests and all these fascinating tropical biomes that we, you know, the temperate zone can't imagine, you know, an incredible biodiversity. Some of the most species-rich parts of the entire world are in Indonesia, you know, so pretty important. Well, the IMF, in the 90s, Indonesia couldn't pay off its giant debts, you know, from the Suharto regime, you know, this U.S.-supported regime, hyper-corrupt for all kinds of reasons that come out when these guys occasionally get overthrown or pushed out of office, you know. And so the IMF said, okay, well, we want new, you're going to make a lot of concessions to us. We have a structural adjustment program. One big thing we want you to do relates to that question that Ron mentioned earlier is your trade policy. So before this, there was a very serious very serious legal structure in Indonesia limiting deforestation and exploitation of resources, and above all, banning export of certain cash crops that could be produced very effectively from deforested land in Indonesia, kind of recognizing if we can serve a global market from this country, there'll be so much demand, they'll cut down all the rainforest. Well, the IMF made them remove those rules, and they're cutting down all the rainforest. And it's incredible, you know, so areas that are, you know, like in Borneo, the island of Borneo, one of the big main Indonesian islands, most of that is part of Indonesia. It's been mostly thickly forested for its entire history. It's getting cut down at a stupendous rate to build to create area for palm oil plantations for export, which was not possible until the IMF forced Indonesia's government against its regime's desire to allow that export, right? And so that means clearing down the rainforest to export palm oil, which is, you know, one of the many commercial oils that goes into your products for your American shampoos and Frito chips and so on. You know, it's one of the many things that goes into your weird products that we consume without ever thinking about it for even a minute. And so the IMF is directly responsible for like the fact that we're about to have the orangutans go extinct in the wild in the next 20 years. Because the IMF, we're clearing all their land away. We're trying to make money here. That's for palm oil plantations for export, you know. This was not nearly on anything like this kind of scale until the IMF came in and demanded that SAP measure in response to Indonesia not being able to meet its debt. obligations, as they like to call them. It's incredible. I actually wrote an academic article on this like years ago, back in 2010 or something, because Indonesia cutting down so much of that rainforest, besides destroying this precious habitat for all of these incredibly rare organisms, some of whom will never be known to science because they're going extinct faster than we can catalog them because we're burning the forest down so fast. But that's also contributing to this huge air quality problem across Asia that they actually call the ABCs, the atmospheric brown clouds, which are caused by industrialization in China, bio waste burning in India by its huge masses of poor in India and Bangladesh, and then smoke from rainforest deforestation for palm oil plantation building in Southeast Asia and Indonesia because of the IMF loosening all those trade restrictions. So like all of these problems we have to deal with come from some financial institution, and the IMF is mostly staffed by the U.S. Treasury Department. Like it's very, very close to America. The World Bank is kind of more run by the EU. Okay. But like this is causing all of our problems today. It's because some global financial institution forced some fairly evil government to allow something that will benefit a tiny number of corporate shareholders who are rich already. Like this just comes out of what global capitalism is. So really the IMF takes countries and uses its leverage over them from their debt, often left over from U.S. military action installing clients, and forcing them more into the global marketplace. No more of your land is going to be destroyed for export so Americans can have cheap products. If you look at other countries, as Jason mentioned, what about other resource-rich countries? Well, you got to look at Iraq. You got to look at the Congo. There's some of the most fucked up, destroyed countries in the world.
Brazil?
Because they have what we even call the resource curse. We even use that term now because what? Don't those things make you money? Yeah, and then Europeans come with militaries and kill everyone over it.
Also,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Pascal.
Rob, I really appreciate the narrative that you're expounding here for our audience. You give such clear examples of the various types of structural.
I told you he was made for this shit, didn't I?
Structural adjustment programs, and there was one that you discussed, particularly. I recall it because it was used so effectively to completely gut Haiti economically. Is the sale and privatization of state-owned assets. Can you elaborate a bit on how that process works in terms of state-owned assets, and what are the actual terms that would normally put the IMF in a position where they would tell a government or a country that you need to either sell off or privatize your state assets, i.e. your ports, telecommunications company, cement company, et cetera, so on and so forth, all of which was done in Haiti, by the way. I would love you to really elaborate on that if you can.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. And I should say, in this article and in this conversation we're having now, we're talking about a huge number of different countries over many decades of history. So there's lots of exceptions to these basic sort of broad patterns that we're talking about here, and tons of like fascinating, weird details. All these countries are very different, and they're in different conditions and have different levels of susceptibility to U.S. control or reliance on a single couple of exports. Like, as soon as the oil price crashes, there goes the Venezuelan economy, but that's the neocolonial model. You'll keep exporting that basic one resource. But with privatization, okay, so the second part there is kind of easy. Like, how do they push it on you? Well, it's very simple. Like the IMF will, they have negotiations, when these countries get to where are about to have a debt crisis, where they suddenly can't pay their debts, or they realize they're coming up on debt payments they can't meet, probably. Call it a debt crisis. At that point, their treasury or, exchequer secretary, whatever they have, their economic policy office will reach out to the IMF and start talking to them. Under what conditions would you pay off our old loans and issue us a new one? What conditions would you force us to meet in order to get that, And, that's all these policies in the SAPs come out of that privatization. Come out of those negotiations. And that includes, big layoffs for all your teachers and healthcare workers. In Europe and America, we keep those because that's how you make people healthy. Once you get rich, like health and education are how you really continue to develop a country. But we're not going to let you poor people do that. You owe us money. Shut up and die. And so in the negotiations, it simply is, you're going to raise interest rates by this much. You're going to lay off this many public sector workers. You're going to lay off this many teachers. You're going to shut down this many country health clinics. And you're going to raise interest rates by this much, taxes by this much. And it's always cutting subsidies for the poor is one I should mention. That's a big one for the IMF, is cutting subsidies in the developing world. I should mention this, then we can get to the rest of that. In the developing world, you have huge masses of people who are poor on a level that's not easy for people in America and Europe to even really picture, because we have poor people, sure, and even homeless, but they can often sort of get by, and there's some public programs that they may be able to rely on, can sort of scrape by in that way. These countries are much, much, much poorer and have had lots more fucked up things happen to them. And as a result, they have far, far more people who are on the edge of dying all the time from full-on starvation and other basic medical needs not being met. And so it's a very life or death negotiation for these people as soon as it comes in. But one of the main things the IMF wants to get rid of, besides is privatization, cutting public employment, and it's always cutting subsidies to the poor, which usually are for food or basic food-related goods like cooking oil, and for fuel. So fuel and food-related subsidies. And the IMF will always say, why won't Egypt or Brazil or Argentina or Bolivia or Bangladesh, why won't you cut your subsidies for the poor? You're just making them rely on the state. If you didn't do that, they just make jobs, because capitalism's magic, and that's how markets work, is through magic wands. They'll just become wealthy. That's not how we did it. It's impossible, but they'll say that. So it's those taking away those social supports. Like, that's a huge part of the budget savings. So stop giving money to poor people so they can barely get enough, coal to get through the winter. Give that money to banks in Germany and in Britain and the United States. It's pretty tough. But how that stuff comes up is just what happens in negotiations among powerful countries. And the IMF, has walked away from negotiations in the past, like especially countries that are kind of maybe serial defaulters like Argentina, or ones that are trying always to get around their IMF strictures, like Egypt or something like that. Usually they'll come back, but they'll let the country suffer through recession, and they'll let them even miss a bond payment so that their credit rating crashes and their currency crashes, which shoots inflation up inside these countries, because you're neocolonial, you'll import everything. So if your currency crashes because the IMF is mad at you, because you won't do what they want, you can kill an economy that way. Like, we're doing it to Russia now on purpose, because we're mad that Russia's got a war in Ukraine. For once, it's not us doing the war, but it's very, very ugly and wrong what they're doing, obviously. So what's happening in Russia now is a thing that we do to countries all the time if they won't conform to the economic model that we're trying to keep them attached to. So the privatization stuff, Pascal asked about, that's a really interesting one. This, as much as I've had time to study this, it really does vary a lot by the polity that you're looking at, by the country that you're looking at. And the way it happens, varies a lot. Like in the fall of the Soviet Union, they did mass privatization of most of the economy, which of course at that time, in that extreme case, was mostly state-owned. And they do it through this voucher program where everyone's supposed to be issued the same amount of vouchers, and people can use those vouchers to buy some of the steel industry or the pipeline industry or the airline industry, whatever formerly public or socialized industry that was. Because of the chaos of Russia in the 90s, a couple oligarchs were able to monopolize those vouchers. And we know how powerful the oligarchs became. Similar things happen in the developing world, often instead of a voucher system, which is sort of unique to that U.S. shock therapy against the former Soviet Union there. More often, it's a full-on sale of the asset. So the government's going to sell this port, or we're selling this large highway, or we're selling the customs station. Whatever it is, often it's based on bidders. So, like the giant public sector operators, like Marriott, or the big engineering scumbags, or, big operators like even, Djene's former alma mater there, Halliburton. Those are big operators too. And they'll come in and say, okay, we'll give you $800 million for the port. All right, we'll give you $900 million, and we'll commit to keeping half the workforce, maybe. This is how these negotiations happen sometimes, and they'll put those into their bids. And sometimes the bids are super corrupt, and sometimes they're not, but they always have the same result, which is privatization of the asset. And so I think the real answer to your question, Pascal, what it's like, is I live in Tacoma, Washington, which is a big port city. We have a very large industrial harbor here with an oil refinery and the huge mega big cranes and all that stuff. But it's publicly, it's an independent entity, but it has a public obligation. These things become private. It's incredible. It's like the roads you drive on aren't public anymore. You can't just use them. You're paying some entity now. And so I think really what it's like is, imagine if you drove out of your house and okay, the little road in my neighborhood now or on my city street, it belongs to McKinsey now, or it belongs to Nestle or Bank of America, and now I have to pay them money every time I drive on it. Oh, it's not so bad, just a couple cents every time I drive on it. So it's this really weird, like in the left we talk about alienation. I can't think of what's more an alien thing than like, oh, the school my kid goes to is run by this billionaire now. I drive there on a road owned by a financial company. I rent everything that I used to get publicly. It's a really alien experience. And of course, the cherry on the cake is don't forget that this is in the developing world, where a lot of the time, the companies that end up buying these assets are based in the old imperial country.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Bit Tyrants.
Like it's that
your
open
book. But that also talks about, a lot of these kind of tech oligarchies. There is a mindset in the world of tech that we are changing the world for the better, especially when you look at the quote unquote developing world. They're constantly doing projects to bring the internet in, satellite, where I live now in Mexico, satellite internet in places that didn't get internet before. We are connecting the world. For what reason do these people want to connect the world and make it a better place?
Yeah, it's to build up that network, right? That's the weird thing about these kind of industries is they're based on networks, So one thing I talk about in the books is, in econ, when you take an econ class, we always say, okay, here's a market. There's supply and demand, and they intersect, and that makes an equilibrium, and people sell all their products, and all the consumers can buy, and all these nice outcomes that you learn about in your Econ 101 class. And they'll say, and at the top of the graph, they'll say, maybe this is the market for cars or smartphones or cable service, and they'll just pick an industry and throw it on there and say, this is that market. But in reality, if you're an economist that's serious at all at the micro econ level, where we look at like how different industries and markets work, like there, it's an amazing diversity is what you discover. Some markets are like that. Some markets are very rich and competitive, and you have lots of little operators all trying to satisfy consumer demand. If you go on the Amazon marketplace or watch YouTube videos, or if you want to just go out and buy a pack of cigarettes in a city, it's a nice, rich market. You have tons of choices to take your consumer dollar to. Other markets are not like that, and they end up monopolized, the opposite of competitive. And maybe it's because you got a John Rockefeller who bought up all the raw material, and now he has an oil monopoly. Carnegie did that with iron oil and got a steel monopoly out of it. Like that'll work. Another way you can get monopoly is through economies of scale. I know in the next hour, we're going to talk about the chip industry, the computer chip industry, where you have this pattern that we call an economy of scale, where you have huge upfront costs. So to build like a modern smartphone processing chip manufacturing plant can cost $15 to $20 billion, an insanely large upfront cost for a business. But then every year you're grinding out hundreds of thousands of fancy chips that are being bought by Samsung and Apple and by the car makers who want fancy chips. And so you have this huge, what we call economy of scale, gigantic upfront cost, but then you're spreading that output over more and more units over time. But it keeps out competitors. And so you get monopolies or oligopolies, where you just have a couple big firms running the industry. So like a monopoly would be like, YouTube. A oligopoly would be like the smartphone operating companies, which is Google and Facebook, or Google and Apple, excuse me. So the network effect is another way you can get to monopoly in an industry. And that's the one that's relevant with tech. Because the thing about markets is they're very different. It depends on the product or service that you're making, how competitive the market's going to be. And in some markets, they're based on networks. So like information markets, where I want to watch the news or a funny show or watch the new Game of Thrones episode or see what my friends are posting online. That's all based on connecting users, creators of YouTube shows or Facebook posts or sexy Instagram clips. You want to connect those creators with the users, as they always tell you on their networks, right? We're connecting you. And so the networks, when you have a market that's mediated through a network, you have like this really, really strong tendency for monopoly, because everyone wants to be on one network so they can all talk to each other, right? What would you rather be, on a network that has one of your friends on it or that has all of your friends on it, So there's a strong tendency for everyone to get on to whatever market or network first gets dominant. Like the incumbent advantage in markets with network effects is enormous, It's very difficult now to make a YouTube competing video site. If people have a video they want to share and the world needs to see it, I mean, I like Vimeo a lot, but that's for like video people who are professionals and have something to share, and they don't mind a somewhat smaller market if it's a interesting, if it's an interesting audience for them, and that's great. But most people will put that shit on YouTube because that's where all the audience is. So it creates what we call a platform economics. It's where everyone it's a maximized network effect. But everyone is turning to a big network hub because the value in this market is based on being able to reach the biggest number of users, So online video, social media are very clearly examples. They're literally textbooks examples of this. People got on Facebook because their friends were on it. People are on Twitter because other edgy dicks that they want to hear from are on it. Like that's how those things work. People are on Instagram because they want to show people their hot bodies. Look at other people's hot bodies. It makes sense. But you get monopolies in these industries as a result of this obvious sort of market-based network incentive. And so that's why AT&T had a phone monopoly all through the 20th century. For those of y'all who are old enough to remember having a phone on the wall. All right, AT&T, like the government made a formal agreement with them, letting them keep their monopoly, but they got it because everyone wanted to get on the one network. I don't want to be on a phone network where I can't call anybody. That's the weird feature of these markets. If I buy a pair of sneakers and then you buy a similar pair, it doesn't have any effect on us. But if you join a network I'm on, the network just gained value from me. There's more people I can connect with or share my art or video with or whatever. And so that's why you have things like Google's YouTube and Meta's Facebook being near total monopolies for long periods of time. No monopoly lasts forever, just like no empire. Over the long term, they come and go. But Microsoft, monopolized computing for 30 years, and there's still an enormously powerful presence in it because of the position they were in from being a monopoly for 30 odd years in one of the most important industries you can have. No one likes Windows, but you use it because that's what all the computers are running. And if I want to make a video game or a computer program, I'm going to make it run on Windows and maybe I'll port it to Apple. They have a much smaller network. And so the network effect is not such a big deal. So it's pretty essential to understand that. Like that's why we have these huge, all the billionaires now come from tech, and why all of our very largest firms in the world are tech platforms. Very unusual to have one industry dominating the biggest firms, But it happens because of those network effects. Like they create out-of-the-box monopolies, as the conservative Economist magazine admitted. And so, we got to socialize these things. I mean, they're so powerful. It's very juicy when they kick out Donald Trump or Alex Jones. Like we all enjoy that moment. That's, I did too. That's fine. We should realize that if we have any success in the U.S. as a socialist movement, they'll be doing us next. They'll throw Sanders and all of us off there too. Their power is stupendous. And it's funny watching conservatives who insisted that they never be regulated and that they're so, that it's the companies that create the jobs and the products. Oh, some of them don't love hyper right-wing politics. Regulate these companies, make them have more right-wing content. It's funny watching conservatives getting tied up in knots when corporate entities in the free market that they love don't do things that they like. Like they're the ones who fight for rejecting gay couples from the wedding cake store and keeping your Southern lunch stand segregated. The conservatives were the ones who defended that for years, but now it's Twitter and Google that are sort of soft peddling the craziest right-wing vaccine disinformation, and the conservatives are out of their mind about it. It goes to show the weird positions you can get in when your politics is based on supporting hierarchy no matter what.
I do want to bring this up before we go. Have you seen these smart Amazon, what's it called? Whole Food stores where there is no cashier? Have you seen this, Pascal? If you have an Amazon,
this was coming. I haven't seen them personally yet.
I guess they've been working on it for the last 4 years. If they scan your hand, if you have an Amazon Prime Plus account, they scan your hands and your face and stuff, and anything you buy in a box or a carton, you just put in your cart and you walk out the store, and then you get charged. Have you seen this new future tech? And I just want to
digital currency. That's the new move. We're going to that. That's the global direction we're moving in now.
That's so interesting, because I will say, let's just skip the register. The register sucks. but it's by tracing you and knowing exactly who you are when you come in and leave the store. And of course, yeah, you have to have all your tech aligned for this. I will say it's exciting that people get to simulate the shoplifting experience. You know, that's the experience that people, a lot of uptight people might benefit from, so that could be positive. But fundamentally, I mean, this is the crazy thing about this era. You know, when we were kids, it was already the push button era, when you just flick a switch to turn on the light and push a button to preheat the stove and turn on your TV with a remote. What all these tech companies are trying so hard to do is to get to a lower level of convenience than that, which is, it's diminishing returns, you know? Like, well, you always turn your light on at this time, so we turn it on.
Yes.
What the?
Yeah, no, it's frightening.
And at the cost of you have all my DNA on file. Like, it just seems like such a goofy deal now. Americans have sort of woken up to that, which I think is good.
But that is a test store. I guess they only have a handful, and then they are in New York. Someone mentioned that they saw it in 2017. I guess they've been doing this for the last 4 years. I just read about it today. I'm sure the layoffs will be coming shortly once people start doing cartwheels about how convenient it is. Professor Larson, will you be joining us in the champagne room? Or do you
sure. I have some time. I love champagne.
Well, I sent you that link on the email. So you should have the champagne room link as well. Do you see it?
Right on. Yeah, I'll follow right through.
Okay. Pascal, I'm going to hush up in the champagne room because I know you have a lot of Milton Friedman hate to share with Larson. And I'm going to let you guys have the best neoliberal hate talk of all time.
I'm excited. That's my kind of part.
So thank you guys so much for joining us. If wherever you're watching the show, there are links in the description to Rob's books, Rob's Twitter. Please follow him. There's also links to the articles, and all the articles he has written in current affairs. You can't see it, but he is rocking his current affairs shirt.
That's true.
He is a columnist in current affairs. We're even going to get into some of the other stuff you've written in current affairs. We have to talk about inflation as well. So we're not done with you just yet.
I just want to say before you go, Jason, Professor Larson, this is a great episode. We really appreciate you being here as a guest. I really admire and appreciate left economists who understand how to dissect the charade of capitalist efficiency and effectiveness and do it so well. And we need more like you. And I hope that you continue writing and continue doing the work that you're doing, because it's so important for us to understand how we are able to really dissect political economy and provide alternative economic models for people who don't understand that there is an alternative to capitalism. And I want to applaud you on the work that you do. I hope that you continue doing it. And I'm very glad that I got a chance to meet you and interview you today. And hopefully you will be willing to be a recurring guest later on in future times on the show.
This is his third time on the show.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And thank you so much, man. I really appreciate that. It's not always, it can be a lonely time on being a left economist. So, it's great to know that, like, this is, people are seeing this, and that it's like helping people raise their consciousness, as we used to say, about all this stuff. So thank you, man.
Also, there's a great debate of Professor Larson debating someone from the Ayn Rand Institute, and I've never yelled that much at a screen.
Yeah, that's you have to constrain that during the debate. It looks bad if you yell. That was fun.
There's a comment on the screen you should read, and I don't believe it's 100% true. Maybe 84% true, but not 100%.
I sure appreciate that. Thank you. No, man, I'm trying to make a small contribution to world socialism over time. So, but I'm delighted to roll over to the other side. I'll see y'all in a minute.
All right, we'll see you in a minute. Thank you guys so much, and we are out.